Can we talk afterwards about making my own dream machine? Please. That was amazing. Hi, everyone. I thought I'd start today by taking a quick poll. How many of you heard of Zappos? All right. Well, cool. How many of you heard of Delivering Happiness, the book and now the company and movement? All right, cool. And then how many of you in the audience feel you know how to predict your long-term sustainable happiness in your own life? Okay. I hear some hisses out there. That's actually about average. I asked this question, I travel the world telling this story now, and it's about 1% to 2% of people in the room that raise their hand. And I thought that was so interesting. Let's take these real life examples here. Upper right, we've got Renee. She just received her financial statement from Merrill Lynch. Thinking, I thought if I saved for my 401k, I would be a happy person. But unfortunately, that was not the case. And take lower right, Stella. She thought, you know what? I'm gonna get a boyfriend at a young age, and I will be a happy girl. After this phone call, she deleted that thought. But actually, I was gonna usually talk about something else, but I just was at TED this past week, and so since I knew I was coming here to CMU, I thought I'd incorporate a little bit of what I learned over there. And so here I am listening to all these speakers, and this one actually two stood out towards the beginning of it all. And Chris Anderson did something different. He kind of had a debate structure where he brought on an economist versus innovation researcher. And they were at opposite ends because basically the economist was saying, we don't have real growth anymore. There's no real innovation since the Industrial Revolution. And the researcher said, are you kidding? You know, we've got the internet. Let's think about all these things that happened in the last 10 years. And then the economist says, just think about it this way. And he put up this visual of the modern toilet and the iPhone. He said, which one would you rather do away with for a year? And I was just thinking, well, imagine if both of those things weren't invented, where would people be using their iPhones? And then they finally got on, and they went back and forth, banter, and then the economist actually said something. He said, you know, what is this anyway? Like, what is the value of what we're talking about? What is the value of this knowledge that we're sharing? What's the value of a friendship? And I'm like, all right, this is something good. And I started thinking, what are the value of these TED Talks? What's the value of an idea worth spreading? And so I had that in my mind, and I was listening to the rest of the talks, and I just noticed one by one how there's all these walks of life, amazing people coming on stage. There's a violinist that was suffering from depression all her life, but she finally found an outlet through music. And through that, she found passion, and she just performed everywhere she could, and she got out of the depression, and she said that now I'm a happy musician. Another woman, she was in Beijing, and her dream was just to be an opera singer. But her mom said, no, I don't think so. And so she thought, you know, I'm not gonna let that stop me. You know, that's just a terrible thing to say to a 15-year-old. So I'm gonna keep on going and persevering what my dream's about. So she found it in books. She just immersed herself in books, and she found what her real passion was. And she said, I realized what dreams are for. It's not necessarily to obtain them. Dreams are about wondering and realizing where they came from, realizing where your passions come from, realizing where your happiness comes from. And so I was listening to all these different speakers, and so many of them said happy in there. So I began to think, I mean, being in this field, could the value of all of this that we're talking about be happiness? And of course you're thinking, well, you're a little biased. I mean, Chief Happiness Officer, come on. What else would you be talking about? But bringing it back in this room, I'm gonna ask you guys, what are your goals in your life? And what's really interesting about this question is that if you ask yourself enough times, like, why you're doing it, why do you wanna have a kid or have a family? Why do you wanna invent a dream machine? Why do you wanna jump out of a floating thing in outer space? And if you ask yourself why, it most oftentimes comes back to this simple notion called happiness. I want to be happy. I want to make the people around me happy. But what's really interesting is that even though this is such a simple notion, the research shows, and I just want to caveat when I say happiness, I talk about the science of happiness and positive psychology, not the let's all hold hands and sing kumbaya type of happiness. Not that there's anything wrong with that. But what the scientists say is that we are, as human beings, are hardwired to seek happiness in our life. So why are we so super bad at figuring out what brings sustainable happiness to us? And we hear this all the time about lottery winners. They think they're going to be happy, then actually their happiness levels goes down. And we also hear about the inverse, which I thought was particularly interesting, of people that lose their sight or lose the use of their limbs, but their happiness levels actually may go up as the research shows. And it becomes like these interesting questions, because we always say, oh, when I get this, I'll be happy, or when I achieve that, I'll be happy. But really, it becomes a moving target. So that's when I started reflecting on my journey here. I'm like, why am I so passionate about this topic of happiness? And so I started reflecting on my life and thinking about high school, when I was sitting in the corner of the room, listening on my Walkman to The Cure and Robert Smith, reading my books from my French class, The Stranger, by TEDxCMU, thinking about all these existential questions, and this was in French, so how much more glum can you be? And then here I am right now, and I have to ask the question, like, how the heck did I get here? So I trace it back to college. If you guys read Delivering Happiness, you know about Tony's whole upbringing as Asian American. I as well have Asian American parents. And so I just lived in this sort of mindset that there's 3 quintessential things to be successful in one's life. And number 1 was get into a good school. Number 2 is become a doctor or a lawyer. And number 3 was learn a variety of musical instruments. And so I was like, sweet. I got it made, I'm successful, I got into Cal, I was studying pre-med, I had all these years of piano under my belt. I was like, I'm done. But when I started studying, I realized this is totally not for me. And so I started wandering, and I stumbled across something called Asian American Studies. And I decided to major in it. And I told my parents. And you guys know exactly what's coming next. They freaked out. They said, are you serious? We sacrificed all these things for you and your brothers. We're working all these jobs simultaneously to support whatever you're going through right now. Your great-great-great-grandparents sailed the Pacific Ocean in an ocean liner and almost died so that you could study yourself. I'm like, damn, they're really good at this guilt thing, but I stood my ground and I did it. I studied, I graduated, and I remember that moment. I was sitting in my apartment, and it was deathly quiet. It was because I couldn't find a job. And I knew what my parents meant. So it was my turn to freak out. I started cold calling every company I knew. And luckily for me, it was just really about timing. The internet was born. So I became an internet consultant at KPMG. And all of a sudden, it was literally overnight. You guys know the whole story of the .com in the late 90s. Like, literally overnight, it was like the money, title, status, just like in my lap. And I was like, well, this is easy. And number 1, I proved my parents wrong, so that was a good thing. Then, as everyone knows, the boom quickly busted, and I got laid off. And I felt like an ultimate loser. It was not only because I lost my job that I felt it, but more importantly, it was because the money, title, status that I thought was so important really meant nothing at all. So I decided to, try to figure out what I'm going to do. And that, in the part of the book, if you've read it, is when Tony and I climbed Mount Kilimanjaro, because I just had to get away from the space, not knowing where I wanted to go. And in that moment, actually, if you think about what happened with Tony's story, like, he had just sold Link Exchange to Microsoft, his first company, for about $180 million. And I had just lost my job. So if you can imagine us climbing this mountain, right, opposite ends of the financial spectrum. But what was really interesting is that we didn't realize this until we started working on the book together, was that we were thinking about the same thing. What are we going to do for the rest of our lives that we're going to be passionate about, that money doesn't matter? So I came back feeling like, wow, this is awesome, this is going to be good. Come back, and this moment happens, and it happens to everyone in this room, if not once, many times. Life does a 190 on you. You get the rug pulled out from under your feet. And for me, it was great, like, facing my greatest fear. And my greatest fear is losing my dad, losing someone I loved. And so I lost him to colon cancer, and then again, that pushed me to another space of what am I going to do every day that's of meaning to me, of substance, of something that I'm really passionate about. So that's when I just started looking at life as a green field. I started writing, I started doing graphic design, I started making films, not really good ones, but I just did it anyway, just because I felt something about it. And through that process, realized what my real values were. If it's not money, title, status, then what was it? And for me, it was the people in my life. And that's how I stumbled across Zappos. And Zappos at that time, when I first met it, was a tiny little startup. And all I wanted to do was just sell shoes to the world. And then it grew up a little bit and said, you know what, we actually want to have the best customer service. And then a couple years later, it grew up even more and said, you know what, it's not about that only, it's about our employees. How do we make them happy? And then finally realizing what they were doing, their higher purpose, essentially delivering happiness to the world. And so those things coming together was a weird parallel in how delivering happiness came about. So, of course, I trace it back to my experience, and this is a picture of Zappos in Las Vegas, and it's actually not a rainbow over it every day, if you can imagine that. But I put this quote down by Maya Angelou because it's not just a great quote or personal mantra. People will forget what you said. People will forget what you did, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. But what's great about this is that Zappos, a company, actually uses this to lead their decisions. And when they say about people, when they talk about people, it's not just about customers. It's about each other. It's about their employees. It's about the vendors and partners they work with. And through that process of being so creative in thinking that way, they were able to, by focusing on culture and company customer service, become a $2 billion brand in gross sales in this past 13 years. And if you guys remember, Amazon acquired them for about $1.2 billion at the time of closing a few years ago. And so that's just one example of all these other companies, because there's all these other research being done on, as an example of the best workplaces to work for in the US, consistently outperform the S&P 500. So what's the secret sauce here? Because we're looking at all these stats just as early as, let's see, it was actually 2 years ago that came out with, Gallup came out with this, was basically they found out that just in the US alone, there's 71% of our employee workforce that are disengaged with what they're doing, which amounts to $300 billion lost in productivity every single year. So here's my thing now. Like, how do we change that around? How do we get disengagement to engagement and productivity higher? And this is when the whole body of science of happiness came into my life. So I wanted to share some frameworks and thoughts that stem from it along the way. One of them was a memoir that was written by this woman by the name of Bronnie Ware. And she basically was in palliative care. So she cared for people at hospices before they passed away. And she noticed there was a similarity and consistency in the things she heard before they died. The top 5 things of them, one of them was, I wish I could just let myself be happier. Another one was, I just wish I could spend more time with friends and family. And another one was, and this is the top one that she found, was I wish I was just true to myself and had the courage to be that way instead of doing what others expected of me. So how do we change that I wish status to, I'm so glad I did? And that's what we're all about. And here's another research study that's been done about what's our constituents of happiness in an individual. 50% of it is said to come from nature, which is genetics essentially. 10% comes from nurture, the environment that you're grown and raised in. And the last 40%, which is really interesting, is what I call the norm. It's our day-to-day actions based on the decisions we make. And so if you think about, that's a pretty good chunk of ownership we have of our happiness. But what's even cooler than that is some really recent studies made by Sean Aker. He wrote a great book by the name of Happiness Advantage. He's actually coupling the norm with the genetics. And he's saying that if you work your brain from a positive space, your brain is actually more effective and more productive to the amount of almost by 30%. And his whole thing summarizes to, success doesn't bring happiness. Actually, happiness brings success. Here's another thing we talk about in the book, and just go over this really quickly, is these are the levers that we can do to be able to increase our happiness in everyday life. A sense of control. Are you making your own decisions? Do you feel that the decisions are leading your way? A sense of progress, perceived progress. Are you developing in life? Are you growing and learning things every day? The third way is connectedness, and that's essentially just the breadth and depth of your relationships. And the last one is vision and meaning, and I'll talk about this a little more, but it's the whole sense of what are you doing that's beyond just yourself. Another framework we talk about is the types of happiness. So the first one we call pleasure or rock star. And this is kind of like going out and partying with your friends, going out all night, or getting an A on the exam, or having a perfect date. And all these kind of pleasures are great and necessary. That's a necessary type of happiness, but unfortunately not very sustainable, unless, of course, you're a rock star. The second more sustainable type of happiness is what we call flow and engagement. So engagement with your coworkers and students and co-students and people at home. And the sense of flow is what is actually a psychological term. It's like when you're so engaged in an activity that hours are going by, but it just feels like minutes. Just a few months ago, there was this college basketball player, I don't know if you guys heard of this, but he beat the most number of, he had the work record for the most number of points scored in one game. And it's like 130 something points. And when he was being interviewed, they're like, what were you thinking? And he's like, I wasn't thinking anything. He was just in that state of flow, so engaged in his zone. And studies show the more you do this on a day-to-day basis, be in your flow, the happier you are. So it's a concept that's actually created by this man by the name of TEDxCMU. And the rumor has it that he created flow when he had to say his name 10 times really fast. And the last, most sustainable form of happiness is what we call higher purpose or meaning. And so if you think about this, if this is what the research shows, if we can really be true to ourselves and figure out what our passions are, and I know we have a lot of them, not just one, and let that align us to our higher meaning and purpose in our life, then not worry about the pleasure stuff so much. We can flip the model around and actually answer that question that I asked at the beginning: what will bring us sustainable happiness? So we'll talk a little bit about the book. Tony and I wrote this, or worked on this together a couple of years ago. We went to Lake Tahoe, locked ourselves in a cabin, and we tried everything to get our motivation going. We had a lot of caffeine, we had a lot of vodka, we had a lot of caffeine in vodka, which seemed like a good idea, but not recommended. Anyway, so the book came out, and it was amazing. We had really great results. I mean, being on bestseller lists and being on best book lists, like Business Book of Wall Street Journal and NPR. Me being the nerd I am, like, NPR, that's awesome. But it was still surreal, but what made it real for us is when we started hearing from people writing us like how they're affected by the book. One woman said, I'm a mom, and now I'm going to be the CMP of my family, a chief managing parent, because I know I can be a better one. All the way to this kid, he's 14 years old, he said, I just started my own company. It's a newsletter company, and hired my first employee, my 9-year-old sister. And all the way to the other end of people that were on the verge of committing suicide. And this just floored me because I didn't even think there was a connection there. We just received one last week, actually. This woman in Vermont, she said, I realized I lost my path, and I came across your book, and I realized what I forgot. I forgot my passion was education. And since then, she started a nonprofit to give back to high-risk communities in education. So all this in this book. And so we didn't know what quite to make out of it. And so when they asked us, like, what's the bus tour going to be like? What are you going to do for the book? We said, we don't know. But all we know is we're inspired by each of these emails that stories coming through. So that's why the theme of the tour was inspire and be inspired. So we set off cross country, 3.5 months, 23 cities. Each of the cities had about 4 to 5 events, so it actually felt like we were planning 80 weddings over that course. So if anyone's been married 80 times, you know exactly what that's like. We stopped by the University of Iowa. One girl, a student, raised her hand and said, Tony, Jenn, can you tell the story of how you got to where you are? So I told them, what I told you, pre-med, dropped out, Asian American Studies. And then 1 week later, she emails us and she said, thanks for telling that story. I just dropped my major pre-med. I was thinking, was that supposed to happen? Because I think our parents are going to chase us down to the next stop. Luckily, it didn't happen, but it made me realize what we're doing out there, sharing our stories and hearing stories of others making changes in their life. Here's another one at Boston's Children's Hospital, and basically, it's really interesting because they're saying, like, we obviously know what we're here for. Our purpose is to keep kids healthy. Yet why are our employees so unhappy? So we talked about values, we talked about empowerment, making sure that the people that are facing their patients, their customers, are happy, so therefore their customers will be happy too. And then afterwards, they gave us a tour, and we met this girl. She just had a kidney transplant a few weeks ago. And you wouldn't be able to tell because she was so excited, and she was telling all these stories. So Tony broke out his iPad and started flipping through, showing the pictures that I showed you of the bus and all that. And she's like, oh my God. And we're like, what is this girl going to say? She's like, that is so cool. I love your iPad. So I guess Steve Jobs wins that vote of inspiration. And this is my last story of the tour. So basically, there was a school called Pueblo High in Arizona, one of the poorest in that area. And the teacher wrote to us and said, we're going to make Delivering Happiness our recommended reading and required reading for our class. And so we were like, awesome. So we sent them a whole bunch of books, and they read it, and we're like, let's surprise them on our tour. So we stopped by, and lo and behold, they surprised us. They had this amazing mariachi band, and they made this amazing spread of food, and we're like floored and realized during that course of that time that most of these kids won't go outside a 15, 20-mile radius of their home ever. But they were so grateful, and we were just so inspired when we left. A few weeks later, the same teacher emails us and said, what we decided? You don't have a Spanish translation for your book. We're going to translate it for you. We're going to crowdsource it with our teachers and administrators and school and students and create this for you. And just give it to you. Do what you want with it. So we took it, and we're like, wow, this is amazing. And just a few months ago, Spanish publisher contacts us, wants to publish the Spanish translation in its form that they gave us. And this is going to be in every Spanish territory in the whole world, their version. And part of the proceeds will be going back directly to their school, to the students that created it. And for us, that was one of those moments of like not understanding and not really knowing what happens when you put something out there. And for me, a big source of inspiration every day. So going back to this, what happened after this tour, it just made me realize that we were at a tipping point around the world. It didn't matter where they came from, whether or not they had a job, what age they were. Everyone was aligned with this thought of happiness. How do we effectively use it and change our lives? So now that's why we created this movement where we're here to spread and inspire happiness in the world. For us, it makes scientific sense, like I talked about, the science of happiness, business sense, and like Zappos and all the other companies that are focusing on employee happiness, and it makes common sense for me. If we could do it now, why would not? So this is how we're doing it. We're doing the 3 C's, happier companies, happier communities, happier cities. By that time, we had, since the time the book came out, we were up to 3,100 cities and 110 countries that have been inspired by what we've been doing. And so for us, the question is, why keep going? Because we really believe, one by one, we're making a happier world. I'll tell a really quick story about this guy. This is actually a reenactment. It's not a real photo. Our friends at Legoland helped us out on this. But there's a guy named Roger Bannister. I don't know if you remember, he beat the 4-minute mile. No one ever thought someone could beat a 4-minute mile. This is in the 1950s. And once he did it, then, actually just 40-something days later, another guy beat it. And more people beat the 4-minute mile. Nothing was changed in the diet or the activity or the exercising regimen. Everything was the same. The only difference was the thought was there. The belief was there that they could actually beat the 4-minute mile. And so for us, we're instilling and seeding those thoughts that happiness can actually change the world. So going back to what I was talking about earlier, if you're true to your weird self, your unique self, if you follow your passion and purpose, we can change short-lived happiness to long-lived happiness. And then think about that and actually do something about it. If it was easy, everyone would be happy. It's not. But if you turn it around and do something about it, I truly have a belief that everyone in this room can create change in the world more than we ever thought possible. And now's the time to do it. Thank you so much for your time.